In many respects, this goes much farther than WTO and NAFTA. The provisions are much more draconian. The powers that they would give are similar to the multilateral agreement on investment, and particularly around intellectual property from an agriculture perspective. Ultimately, they're imposing conditions, for instance, control on the rights to save and reuse seed for farmers, which are fundamental to agriculture. The intellectual property provisions would allow, for example, those holding those plant breeders' rights or patents on seeds, the right for preemptive seizure of immovable and movable property and the freezing of bank accounts of suspected infringers. Now, this goes way beyond any purview of in any trade agreement, and what that would mean for farmers in particular is, for example, if they found their crop to be contaminated with a patented or protected variety, they could be accused of infringing. They could have their equipment, their crops, their farms seized, and their bank accounts frozen in order to assure these very monopoly biotech companies, grain companies, or others to make sure that they are adequately compensated in case a decision goes against them. So it goes far beyond the scope of even the WTO, and even the PBR legislation that's required in this agreement goes beyond what our international commitments are at the WTO and PBR as plant breeders' rights. And that translates back into the cultural areas too, into copyright, et cetera, et cetera.
Sort of a detailed question. That big document is all on your website, is it? I can read it through. Okay. The Canadians are making some fairly sweeping requests, as I understand it, of the Europeans too. Alberta beef ranchers would sure like to have their beef sold in restaurants in Paris. They're going to get a no. At the end of the day, are the no's going to cancel each other out, and it will have been much ado about nothing?
The problem is that the opening up of trade for Canadians like beef, or for example the issue around biotech Canadian crops getting into Europe. In Appendix 1B in the sanitary and phytosanitary chapter, they exempt all European GM regulations from this agreement. So the reality is that there are almost no advantages for Canadians in terms of opening up trade, but there's an awful lot of advantages for those huge monopoly corporate players to protect their interests and to extend their control through a series of measures that really will change the face of, at least for Canadian farmers, of agriculture and how they conduct it, and of course for the cultural industries, for labor, etc. It's all about not trade, but altering who dominates how policy is constructed in Canada.
No, Denis Lemelin, Canadian Union of Postal Workers. Maybe I can give an example about the Postal Service. So here in Canada, the Postal Service is regulated because Canada Post has the exclusive privilege for the letter. But what you see in Europe now, it's all deregulated. And in January 2011, all the sector will be deregulated. So what they want with this service is really full access to all the services and all the market around postal services. And in some ways there will be like a regulatory body, but this regulatory body would just open the door. And I'm sure you remember the suit that United Postal Service for $200 million around the NAFTA. And that's something important because you open the market and big corporations like TNT, about the service, DHL, and all these European are coming in and will take the service. And one thing they really want is to deregulate the international mail. And that's a big debate here because in some ways, if you open and the market is deregulated, in some ways, what will happen with our postal service? We are a large country, 33 million people, and we have the universal service and the exclusive privilege with protecting the service and the job. And that's something important because if you can remember, us as union, we've always been against all the free trade agreement, FTA, NAFTA. We're against this one because it's always the issue at the end is job. It's people negotiating behind doors around the issue for big corporations that they have access to everybody, to everything, but at the end, who's doing the day-to-day job? It's our worker. And in some way, we have to be involved and we have to protect this job. It's why we signed this trade justice agreement. It's something important for the workers that we have an open debate on all these issues.
Just say,
Absolutely.
I'd like to just speak about procurement because the biggest purchasers of goods and services are governments with our tax dollars. And governments, the subnational governments, that is provincial, municipal governments, have the ability now to use our tax dollars for economic development, for environmental considerations, for reaching out, for example, providing jobs for First Nations people. They can put conditions on it. What this deal would do is remove the power of government and open that up to the market completely. So we already have a trade imbalance with Europe at a rate of $15 to $1, 15 billion to 1 billion Canadian. And we have already lost over the last few years more than 500,000 manufacturing and value-added jobs in Canada. This agreement would prevent procurement such as the City of Toronto TTC procurement, which directed $1.2 billion, potentially going to $3 billion, the largest transit purchase in North America, from deciding that was going to be a Canadian purchase. And an independent study found that for every job created directly through that purchase, there would be an additional 9 jobs created through spin-offs, sub-assembly services, etc. So it is this basic economic development and, in fact, environmental and social justice development that would be prevented with this agreement. Pretty significant and very explicitly demanded by the Europeans. So that's a big concern, I think, for us, and should be a concern for all Canadians.
Just try and answer your question. You asked a general question about, I mean, is Europe going to give these things to Canada that's demanding? And I think there's, like you said,